My best friend once told me the exact day my engagement would fall apart. She described the betrayal at my office months before it happened. She even warned me my own family would try to steal what was left to me. I laughed at her. I called her paranoid. But when every single prediction came true, I realized the real danger wasn't her visions, it was my refusal to believe them. I used to think premonitions were just dramatic words people used when they wanted attention. I believed in hard work, in logic, in facts you could hold in your hands. My life was stable, predictable, carefully planned. I was engaged to a man I'd known for 3 years. I had a rising career in corporate marketing. I had a small but close circle of friends. And at the center of that circle was Leela. Leela had always been different. Not strange in a way that pushed people away, but observant in a way that made you feel seen a little too clearly. She noticed patterns the rest of us missed. She would watch people quietly during conversations, her dark eyes steady, as if she were listening to something beneath the words. The first time she predicted something, I laughed. We were sitting in a cafe downtown 2 weeks after I got promoted. I was glowing with pride, scrolling through congratulatory messages on my phone. She stirred her tea slowly and said, almost casually, "Don't trust Martin." I looked up. "My boss?" She nodded. "He smiles too wide when he compliments you. He's building something, and you're part of it." I rolled my eyes. "Leela, this is real life, not some psychological thriller." She didn't argue. She just said, "Okay, just keep copies of your work at home." That was it. No dramatic music, no lightning strike, just a quiet suggestion. I ignored it. The second time, it wasn't about work, it was about Daniel, my fiancé. We were trying on dresses for my engagement party when she caught my wrist and said, "Don't set a date yet." I laughed again. "Why are you like this?" She hesitated, which was rare for her. "Because I think he's already halfway out." I remember feeling irritated, defensive. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he loved me. He brought me coffee in the mornings. He kissed my forehead before bed. He talked about our future house with a backyard and a dog. "You're projecting," I told her. "Not every man is hiding something." Her face softened, but she didn't apologize. "Just wait before you sign anything." I wish I could say I considered her words seriously. I didn't. I chalked it up to her cautious nature. Leela had grown up in a home where nothing was stable. She expected collapse because collapse was familiar to her. I, on the other hand, believed I was building something solid. The third warning came on the night of my father's funeral. Grief has a way of blurring memory, but I remember this part clearly. The house was full of relatives I hadn't seen in years. My aunt hugged me too tightly. My cousin kept asking strange questions about paperwork. My stepmother barely looked at me. Leela stood beside me near the kitchen doorway and whispered, "They're going to challenge the will." I felt a wave of exhaustion. "Please, not tonight." "They're already talking about it." "How would you even know that?" She gave me a look that said she didn't need to explain. Just be prepared. That one hurt the most, not because it sounded impossible, but because it sounded cruel. My father had promised me that the lake house would be mine. It was the only place we'd ever felt like a real family. The thought of anyone trying to take it felt obscene. "You see danger everywhere," I snapped quietly. Leela's jaw tightened. "No, I see patterns." I stopped inviting her out as often after that. Not consciously, but I started choosing lighter company. Friends who celebrated with me instead of warning me. Friends who told me everything would be fine. And for a while, it was. Until the first crack appeared. It started at work. Martin called me into his office one Thursday afternoon. His smile was wide, too wide. "There's been a complaint," he said, "about the campaign strategy." I blinked. What complaint? He slid a printed presentation across the desk. My presentation, but altered, data missing, conclusions twisted. I didn't submit this version, I said slowly. He folded his hands. It was sent from your login. I felt my stomach drop. Within a week, an internal review was opened. Within 2 weeks, I was placed on administrative leave, and within a month, I was quietly let go for ethical inconsistencies. I remember sitting in my car in the company parking lot, hands shaking, Leela's voice echoing in my head, "Keep copies of your work at home." I hadn't. When I told her what happened, she didn't say, "I told you so." She just closed her eyes for a moment, like she was absorbing something heavy. "He needed someone to blame," she said gently. "You were rising too fast." I wanted to be angry at her. Instead, I felt something colder. Fear. Because she had been right. Daniel tried to comfort me at first, but something in him shifted after I lost the job. The wedding plan slowed. The venue deposit was suddenly too risky. He began staying late at work. His phone turned face down more often. One evening, I walked into the apartment quietly and heard him laughing in the kitchen. A laugh I hadn't heard in months. Light, intimate. He froze when he saw me. "Who was that?" I asked. "Just a colleague." But his eyes flickered, and I knew. The confrontation came 3 weeks later. There were tears, apologies, a confession about confusion and timing. He had met someone else during a conference months ago. Months, right around the time Leela told me he was halfway out. When he left with a suitcase, I felt less shock than I expected. Mostly I felt the eerie weight of inevitability, as if I had been handed the script long ago and chosen not to read it. But nothing prepared me for the final prediction. The will reading happened in a sterile lawyer's office that smelled of dust and old paper. My father had left the lake house to me, just as he promised. My stepmother's smile didn't reach her eyes. 3 days later, I received notice of a legal dispute. They were contesting my father's mental competence at the time he signed the document, exactly as Leela had warned. I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by unopened mail, legal letters scattered like fallen leaves. My career was gone, my engagement shattered, and now my family was preparing to drag me into court. I called Leela that night, my voice barely steady. "How did you know?" I asked. There was a long silence on the other end. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I just watched." "Watched what?" "People. Their micro-expressions, the way they move when they lie, the way ambition smells before it shows its teeth. It's not magic. But it felt like magic, because every single prediction had come true, and I had dismissed her every time. That was the moment something inside me cracked, not just from betrayal, but from the realization that I had been handed protection and thrown it away. What I didn't know yet was that her final premonition was still waiting, and that one would change everything. I couldn't sleep that night. The apartment felt smaller, darker, as if the walls themselves were judging me for ignoring Leela's warnings. I kept imagining the lake house, the only place that felt like home, being wrenched from me by relatives who had never cared until money was involved. I thought about Daniel, about how easily he had turned away from promises he once swore would last forever. And I thought about Leela. Quiet and unassuming, always watching, always knowing. The next morning, I made myself a weak cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at the scattered letters. Each envelope carried a story I wasn't ready to face. Legal notices, bank statements, letters from friends who didn't know how to reach me after I lost everything. I picked up one letter, trembling, and opened it. It was from a lawyer representing one of my father's distant cousins, a woman I had met only twice. They were claiming partial ownership of the lake house, citing obscure clauses in a will I had never known existed. My stomach churned. Every sentence read like a blade sliding into my chest. I didn't even have the energy to call Leela that morning. Part of me wanted to scream at her, blame her for her words that had become self-fulfilling prophecies. But another part of me, a quieter, more desperate part, needed her voice. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I called her. The line clicked. Then her calm, familiar voice answered. "I'm here," she said, almost like she had been expecting the call. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Everything's falling apart. My job, Daniel, my father's house. I feel like I've lost control of my life." She was silent for a moment, then said, "You haven't lost control. You just haven't seen the pattern yet." "Pattern?" I asked, exasperated. "Leela, they're suing me. My fiancé left me. My career is gone. What pattern could make this make sense?" "The pattern is people," she said softly. "Not luck, not fate, people. And what you do now determines whether this ends in ruin or recovery." Her words were strange. They were calm, almost meditative, but underneath there was a warning. She wasn't telling me what would happen next. She was telling me I still had a choice. I hung up and stared at the phone. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that there was some way out of the chaos, but reality felt like a tide dragging me under. The following weeks were hell. I hired a lawyer, tried to organize my finances, and attempted to contact Daniel to understand if there was any closure left in that relationship. Each call ended in frustration or silence. Friends who had once been close were distant. Some had chosen sides, whispering in corners, judging me for losing the life they thought I had so effortlessly had. And through it all, Leela was there, quietly, methodically, offering advice when I asked, never demanding, never pushing. One evening, after spending hours sorting through the documents related to the lake house, I found a letter tucked at the bottom of the pile. It was from my father, dated weeks before he died. I hadn't seen it before. My hands shook as I opened it. "My dearest," it read, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone. There will be people who will try to take what is yours. There will be friends who turn their backs, but you are stronger than you realize. Keep your eyes open. Trust those who see the truth, and never ignore a warning when it comes from someone who knows." I stared at the words, and for the first time since his death, tears streamed down my face. My father had seen the danger coming, much like Leela had. I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity. The fight wasn't just about property or money. It was about trusting myself to navigate the treachery of people who had hidden intentions. Leela came over that evening. I hadn't expected her, but when she arrived, she simply stood at the doorway, observing. I motioned for her to sit. "I don't know how you do it," I said, pouring coffee for both of us. "How you see these things before they happen." "She told you," she said quietly. "I don't know. I just notice. I pay attention to what others ignore. And you ignore the warnings until it's almost too late." Her words stung, but they also grounded me. There was no magic, no supernatural force at play, just her observation, her acute awareness of human nature, and she had been right every single time. Over the next few days, I took her advice seriously. I started documenting everything: emails, contracts, interactions. I contacted a second lawyer to cross-check the claims against the lake house. I spoke to distant relatives and even the family friend who had been quietly supportive during my father's funeral. Each small step began to untangle the web that had been tightening around me. It was during one of these days that I realized something unexpected. A small network of support had formed. Not many, but enough. People who genuinely cared, who weren't trying to take advantage, who had stayed present when others fled. Leela had always seen them. I hadn't. And now I did. Meanwhile, Daniel's absence left an empty echo. I couldn't lie to myself. I still hurt. But in that hurt, I began to understand a harsh truth. Sometimes people leave not because of who you are, but because of who they are. And sometimes the people who stay, quiet, watchful, seemingly strange friends like Leela, are the ones that matter most. A month later, the court date arrived. I walked into the small, sterile room carrying my folder of documents, copies, and evidence. My stepmother was there, composed, confident, surrounded by her legal team. My distant cousin smiled faintly, as if victory was already hers. I felt my heart pound. For a moment, panic rose, but then I remembered Leela's advice. Trust what you see and prepare for what you don't. The hearing was tense. My lawyer presented evidence meticulously. I listened silently, noting every reaction, every slip, every shift in body language. Each small detail mattered. Every time my stepmother claimed a forgotten clause, we countered with documents my father had signed, letters he had written, testimony from family friends who had witnessed his intentions. At one point, my stepmother's expression faltered, a subtle tightening around the eyes, the way her fingers curled against the table. It was almost imperceptible, but Leela had taught me to notice these things, and I did. That small falter became the thread that unraveled her entire argument. By the end of the day, the judge ruled in my favor. The lake house was mine, just as my father intended. Relief hit me in waves, and for the first time in weeks, I exhaled fully. I felt exhausted, but victorious, not just because of the legal victory, but because I had survived the psychological onslaught, the betrayal, and the near collapse of everything I held dear. After the hearing, Leela and I walked outside. The autumn air was crisp, filling my lungs with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in months. I turned to her, my gratitude spilling over. "You were right," I said, the words barely audible over the hum of passing cars. "Every single warning, every single one. I should have listened." She didn't smile. She simply nodded. "You listened when it mattered most. That's what counts." I looked at her, really looked at her, and understood something profound. Leela never wanted control over my life. She didn't seek to frighten me or manipulate me. She simply saw things, truths others overlooked, and offered them. I had been too stubborn, too confident in my own worldview to take her seriously until the consequences forced me to. That night, I sat by the fireplace in the lake house, watching the flames flicker. I reflected on the months that nearly destroyed me, the loss of my career, the betrayal of someone I loved, the legal battles, and I realized the cruel irony. Each disaster had been a lesson, a harsh but necessary teacher, guided by someone who had only ever wanted to protect me. I called Leela later, just to hear her voice. "I don't think I've ever truly thanked you." "I don't have to," she replied softly. "You survived. That's thanks enough." I realized then that survival wasn't just about winning battles or reclaiming property. It was about seeing people clearly, trusting intuition, and valuing those who quietly safeguard you, even when you don't understand how or why. Months passed. My career slowly rebuilt itself on freelance work, and eventually I returned to corporate consulting, this time with more caution, more awareness. Daniel remained a memory, a painful but enlightening chapter, and the lake house, my sanctuary, became a symbol of resilience, of foresight, and of the truths we ignore at our own peril. Even now, I carry Leela's words with me. Patterns are everywhere. People reveal themselves if you know how to watch, and sometimes the most unsettling premonitions are. The weeks after the court victory were quiet, almost unnaturally so. The storm of legal battles and betrayals had passed, but in the calm, I realized how deeply scarred I was. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the expressions of those who had tried to take from me, the glances, the sly smiles, the tiny moments of deception. It was unsettling, but strangely grounding. I understood now that life wasn't always about who we trusted. It was about learning to see the truth, even when it hurt. Lila visited often, though she never lingered too long. Her presence was calm, like a lighthouse in a fog. We would sit in the living room, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about everything and nothing. She never pushed, never offered unsolicited advice, but I learned to read her as much as she read others. A subtle raise of an eyebrow, a pause before answering, the faintest shift in posture, they all carried meaning. One evening, over tea by the fireplace, I finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. Why me, Lila? Why did it have to be me who went through all of this? She looked into the flames, her eyes reflecting the flickering light. She said, "Because you're capable of surviving it," she said softly. "People like you, they think life is predictable. They trust everyone. They assume kindness is universal. And when they're forced to see the truth, when the veil is lifted, they become stronger." I wanted to argue, to say that survival felt more like punishment than a gift, but I couldn't. She was right. Each betrayal, each loss had sharpened me. And yet the final premonition she had given me, the one she had warned me would be the hardest, still hung over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. It came in a quiet moment, just days after the court ruling. We were walking along the lake shore, the water calm and reflective, the trees swaying in a late autumn breeze. Lila stopped, looked at me seriously, and said, "The hardest part isn't over yet. There's one more test, and it will touch everything you thought you knew about your family, your friends, even yourself." I froze. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately. She simply pointed to the water. "Watch the reflection," she said. "What you see there is not always what's real. You'll have to decide what to trust and what to let go." Her cryptic words unsettled me, but I trusted her enough now to listen. I knew that the coming days would challenge me in ways I hadn't yet imagined. That challenge came sooner than expected. One morning, I received a call from a distant relative I barely knew, my Uncle David. He was calm, smooth, and polite, but something about his tone made my chest tighten. He said he wanted to talk about the family estate, about assets my father had left beyond the lake house. He invited me to his office in the city. I wanted to refuse, but Lila's words echoed in my mind. What you see there is not always what's real. I had to see it for myself. When I arrived, the office was sleek, modern, and intimidating. David greeted me warmly with that practiced smile, but I noticed the slight twitch in his left eye when he mentioned my father's investments. We sat, exchanged pleasantries, and then he began to outline what he called a fair redistribution of assets, implying that the wealth my father had built should be shared among all relatives. I listened politely, hiding my suspicion. Something felt off. Every sentence he spoke seemed rehearsed, calculated. But I had learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts screamed that this meeting was not about fairness. "I understand your position," I said carefully, "but these assets were explicitly entrusted to me in my father's records." He leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowing slightly. "Your father wanted unity in the family. He would have wanted you to consider the bigger picture." I nodded, pretending to consider it, but inside a storm was building. I had been burned before. I would not be burned again. When I left, I called Lila immediately. "It's happening," I said. "My uncle is trying to manipulate me. I can feel it." She didn't sound surprised. "I know," she said simply, "and you'll have to handle it the same way you handled the others. Observe, prepare, and act. Don't let sentiment cloud judgment." Over the next few days, I gathered everything: documents, emails, proof of my father's intentions, records of conversations. I studied my uncle's habits, the patterns of his speech, even the way his assistants moved around the office. Every detail mattered. Lila taught me to notice these things, and now they were my shield. When I confronted him, I remained calm. I presented the evidence, pointed out discrepancies, and questioned inconsistencies in his claims. He tried to charm, to guilt, to intimidate, but I had grown stronger. I could see through the mask. By the end of our meeting, he realized I wasn't the naive niece he had expected. He left, politely, but defeated. I called Lila afterward, relief spilling over. "I did it," I said. "You did," she confirmed. "But remember, this isn't about defeating people. It's about understanding them, seeing them clearly, and protecting yourself without losing who you are." Her words struck me. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. It was about clarity, about discernment, about knowing who to trust and how to survive in a world that often wore friendly faces while hiding teeth. The months that followed were calmer but not easy. Rebuilding my career took time, patience, and careful maneuvering. I accepted freelance projects at first, then gradually returned to consulting roles. My reputation, once tarnished by false accusations, slowly repaired itself through hard work and transparent communication. Daniel remained a shadow of the past, a memory of what betrayal felt like from someone I loved. I still thought of him, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with anger, but most of the time I reminded myself that people reveal themselves over time, in moments small and large, and he had revealed his true nature. As for Lila, our bond deepened. I no longer questioned her predictions or doubted her insights. I realized they weren't curses or eerie visions. They were warnings, opportunities to act wisely before disaster struck. She had saved me in subtle ways over and over, and I only understood the magnitude after living through the consequences of ignoring her advice. One evening, I walked alone along the lake, reflecting on everything that had happened. The water mirrored the sky, calm and endless. I thought about my father, his letters, his guidance even from beyond the grave. I thought about Daniel, about betrayal, and about resilience. And I thought about Lila, the quiet observer who had warned me when I refused to see. I understood then what she meant by patterns. Life was full of them. People, events, coincidences, they all formed a tapestry visible only to those willing to notice. Most people ignored the warnings, brushing them off as paranoia or fear. I was one of those people, but I had learned, painfully, that ignoring the signs came with a cost. In the quiet of that evening, I made a promise to myself. I would never ignore a warning again, not from intuition, not from observation, not from someone who cared enough to speak the truth. I would remain vigilant, thoughtful, aware. I would trust my instincts and those of people who had proven themselves to be genuinely invested in my well-being. And for the first time, I felt a strange peace, not because life was perfect, far from it, but because I had survived and I had grown stronger in ways I could never have imagined. The betrayals, the premonitions, the heartbreaks, they were all part of a harsh education in the nature of people, in the reality of life, and in the importance of listening when someone who sees the truth tries to guide you. I returned home that night to find a letter from Lila, handwritten, simple. It read, "You saw what others couldn't. You acted when you needed to. You are ready for whatever comes next. Trust yourself. Trust what you see. Always." I placed the letter on my nightstand and sat in silence, reflecting on the months of turmoil, loss, and revelation. The journey had been painful, almost unbearable at times, but I had emerged wiser, stronger, more discerning. I had learned to recognize patterns, to understand people, and to navigate the treacherous waters of life with clarity. And I knew, deep down, that Lila's final premonition, the hardest one, wasn't over yet. I could feel it in the quiet, in the undercurrent of life around me. Something was coming, something that would test not just my resilience, but the very core of who I had become. I was ready. The days following that night felt different. I woke with a heightened awareness, a quiet alertness that I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't paranoia, it was vigilance. the kind of clarity that comes only after having been blindsided too many times. Every interaction, every conversation, every fleeting expression now carried meaning. I found myself observing, without judgment, noticing subtle shifts in tone, gestures, and timing. It was exhausting at first, but also strangely empowering. It was during this period that the final premonition began to take shape. Leela had been hinting at it for weeks, cryptic and cautious, never giving specifics, only warnings. "The hardest part isn't over," she had said. "It's closer than you think." I tried not to obsess over it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the next challenge would be personal, deeper than money, betrayal, or heartbreak. One evening, I received a call from my younger cousin, Sarah. She was someone I'd always trusted, someone I'd grown up with, and she sounded frantic. "I need your help," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's about the estate, about Dad's investments. You have to come over. It's urgent." I felt my stomach tighten. My first instinct was caution. My second was worry. Sarah had always been kind, but the urgency in her voice suggested more than confusion. It suggested danger, deceit, or a crisis I wasn't prepared for. I called Leela immediately. "Something's happening," I said, pacing in my living room. "Sarah called. She sounds terrified." "Go," Leela said firmly, "but stay observant. Nothing is as simple as it seems. Watch for inconsistencies, and remember, patterns are your guide." I drove to Sarah's apartment, each mile increasing the knot in my chest. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar. I knocked cautiously. She emerged, pale, clutching a folder of papers. Her hands were shaking so violently that I feared they might tear the documents. "Thank God you came," she said, ushering me inside. "It's happening again. Someone's trying to take everything. I found these letters, emails. They're manipulating Dad's old accounts, trying to redirect funds. I don't know who to trust." I took the papers from her and scanned them quickly. Sure enough, there were formal-looking requests to transfer large sums, authorize payments, and change access. But some of the details didn't match up. The dates were off, signatures didn't match, and there were subtle patterns that suggested someone close to the family had orchestrated it. My pulse quickened. "Sarah, who else knows about this?" I asked. "Only a few people, Uncle David, some distant relatives, and maybe Daniel?" Her voice faltered. I froze. Daniel? He had been gone for months, but a surge of fear and disbelief ran through me. Had he really returned? Had he been involved in some deeper plot? My mind raced, but I forced myself to focus. Panic would only make it harder to see the patterns, and Leela had drilled into me that clarity came first. Over the next few hours, we pieced together the puzzle. There were multiple attempts to access the investments, some legitimate-looking, others clearly fraudulent. Someone had gone to great lengths to obscure the trail, using email accounts, forged documents, and even social media messages to mislead anyone who tried to intervene. The deeper we dug, the more intricate the web became, and every new detail led me back to one unsettling conclusion. The orchestrator was someone who knew the family intimately, someone who studied patterns and behavior, much like Leela did, but with malicious intent. I felt a chill. This wasn't just about money, this was personal, and the realization hit me with a force I wasn't ready for. The final premonition Leela had warned about wasn't a prediction of external danger. It was a warning of betrayal from someone I trusted deeply. I called Leela again. "It's worse than I thought," I said. "The person behind this, it's someone close. I can feel it." Her voice was steady, almost serene. "I know. You'll see the truth soon enough. But remember, the challenge isn't just identifying the betrayer, it's surviving the revelation. Some truths are harder to face than any loss you've endured." I spent the night at Sarah's, combing through the documents, tracing emails, analyzing every communication. By morning, a pattern began to emerge. There were repeated references, subtle cues in tone, phrasing, and timing that pointed unmistakably towards someone I considered a friend, someone I trusted implicitly. When I confronted the evidence, I felt a sinking dread. Daniel. It had to be him. Every manipulated account, every forged signature, every suspicious email led back to him. He had re-entered my life, not for reconciliation, not for closure, but to exploit me further. The betrayal cut deeper than before. It wasn't just abandonment anymore. It was calculated manipulation, a deliberate attempt to destroy the stability I had clawed back. I didn't contact him immediately. Instead, I called Leela. "It's Daniel," I said, my voice tight. "He's behind it." She was silent for a moment, then said, "I suspected as much. This is the final test. You'll have to confront him, but do so carefully. The truth can destroy if you're not prepared. Remember everything you've learned, the patterns, the observations, the vigilance. You are stronger than the last time he hurt you." The confrontation was inevitable. A week later, I arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing family matters. I brought all the documentation, prepared for every excuse, every lie. When he arrived, I studied him carefully. The confidence, the casual demeanor, it was all a mask. But underneath, I noticed the familiar slips, the patterns I had learned to read over the past months. A slight hesitation before denying responsibility, the micro-expressions of guilt he tried to suppress, the subtle avoidance of eye contact when he mentioned transactions. I laid out everything calmly, each document, each discrepancy, each manipulated account. He tried to charm, to gaslight, to convince me it wasn't his doing, but I didn't flinch. Every attempt to deceive was met with evidence, every denial countered by proof. Finally, he broke. His facade crumbled, replaced by anger, then desperation. "You don't understand," he shouted. "It was the only way." "The only way to what?" I interrupted. "To betray me again? To exploit my trust? To destroy the family and the life we had?" He couldn't answer. The patterns were undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. The premonition Leela had warned about wasn't just about the betrayal itself. It was about facing it with clarity, not emotion, and surviving the confrontation with your own dignity intact. After hours of tense negotiation, he agreed to reverse all unauthorized transfers and relinquish control over the accounts. The relief was immense, but it was bittersweet. Trust had been shattered beyond repair, and I knew I could never allow myself to be vulnerable with him again. I returned to the lake house that evening, exhausted, drained, but also oddly serene. I called Leela, and when she answered, I simply said, "It's over. I survived it." She was quiet for a moment, then replied, "Yes, and now you understand the full measure of what I've been trying to teach you. Premonitions are warnings, yes, but the real test is in your response. You've learned to see, to act, to survive, and that is more valuable than anything you could have lost or regained." Her words settled over me like a warm blanket. I finally understood the full scope of the journey I had been on. Every loss, every betrayal, every premonition, it had all been a lesson in awareness, resilience, and the power of discernment. In the following months, I rebuilt my life with a newfound wisdom. My career flourished on a foundation of careful observation and diligence. I strengthened my relationships with people who had proven trustworthy, and I learned to recognize the subtle cues that signaled honesty and loyalty. Most importantly, I understood the value of people like Leela, the quiet observers, the ones who see what others cannot, who offer guidance even when ignored. They are rare, precious, and often the difference between disaster and survival. I also realized that premonitions, whether born of intuition, observation, or a heightened awareness of human behavior, are not to be feared or dismissed. They are signals, calls to action, opportunities to prepare and protect, and the cost of ignoring them can be devastating, as I had painfully learned. Looking back, I saw the journey not as a series of tragedies, but as a crucible that forged me into someone stronger, more perceptive, and more resilient. I had faced betrayal from those I loved, threats from those I trusted, and challenges that seemed insurmountable, and through it all, I had survived. As the sun set over the lake, painting the water in hues of gold and crimson, I felt a deep sense of closure. I had faced the premonitions, confronted the betrayals, and emerged wiser and more capable. And I knew that after the confrontation with Daniel, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal after the chaos I'd endured. The lake house, once a source of anxiety and contested memories, had transformed into a sanctuary. Every morning, I would walk along the shoreline, the crisp air clearing my mind, reminding me that I had survived what so many would have considered insurmountable. Leela often joined me during these walks, though she never spoke unless necessary. Her quiet presence had become comforting, like a shield I could lean on without feeling weak. I began to notice the subtleties of life again, the things I had ignored in my former preoccupation with career and social status. The way the wind rustled the leaves, the soft hum of birds at dawn, the distant laughter of children playing nearby. There was beauty in observation, and I had learned that paying attention could protect as well as heal. Leela had taught me this, though indirectly. One morning, I received a letter from a lawyer representing another distant relative. I almost didn't open it, but something compelled me to check. Inside was a notice. My father had left behind additional assets in a trust, funds that had been growing quietly and carefully managed. However, access required coordination and careful legal oversight. I sighed, realizing the process wouldn't be simple. But this time, I felt ready. I wasn't naive anymore. I had learned how to see what others overlooked, and I had Leela's guidance to help interpret the subtle signals of deceit or malice. I contacted her and explained the situation. "It's complicated," I said, "and I feel like there's someone else trying to manipulate the process. I can't prove it yet, but I can sense it." She responded with her usual calm. "Then you'll have to trust your observations and take measured steps. The pattern is there. You just have to follow it." I spent weeks piecing together the trust documents, contacting lawyers and analyzing statements. Every phone call, every email, every meeting with financial advisors became an exercise in scrutiny. I noticed inconsistencies that others overlooked, a slight hesitation when discussing distributions, vague explanations about management fees, a certain pride that masked subtle deceit. Leela had trained me well. I saw what others could not. One evening, as I sat surrounded by paperwork, Sarah arrived unexpectedly. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "about what you and Leela taught me. Observation matters, patterns matter, and now I'm starting to notice things too. I think someone's trying to siphon funds from the trust, and I can show you the trail." Her eagerness was a mixture of fear and determination. Together, we traced transactions, matched emails, and documented behavior. Slowly, the web of deceit began to unravel. The perpetrator wasn't Daniel this time, but someone equally close, a cousin I had grown up with, someone I had trusted blindly because family ties seemed inviolable. The betrayal was staggering, not in magnitude of money, but in the violation of trust. I felt a pang of anger, tempered by clarity. I could no longer let emotion cloud my judgment. I had learned the hard way that betrayal often comes from those closest to you. The lessons of the past months were etched into my very being. Trust must be earned continuously, and vigilance is essential. When we finally confronted the cousin, the encounter was tense. I laid out the evidence meticulously, pointing out inconsistencies, forged documents, and suspicious communications. At first, there was denial, then excuses, then anger, but eventually, faced with irrefutable proof, they had no choice but to comply. The trust funds were secured, and the final pieces of my father's legacy were preserved. It was during this period of recovery and consolidation that I began reflecting more deeply on Leela's role in all of this. Her premonitions had not been magical predictions, but disciplined observations, insights into human behavior honed over years of noticing patterns, reading expressions, and understanding subtle cues. She had warned me repeatedly, but I had dismissed her advice until the consequences became undeniable. One evening, as we sat on the porch overlooking the lake, I turned to her. "Leela," I said, "I understand now. Every warning, every premonition, it wasn't about scaring me, it was about preparing me, and I ignored it until it was almost too late." She smiled faintly, eyes reflecting the sunset. "You had to experience it for yourself. Understanding alone isn't enough. Action matters, and you've taken the right actions now. That's what matters." I nodded, realizing the lessons weren't just about money or betrayal. They were about awareness, discernment, and resilience. Life would always throw challenges, sometimes subtle, sometimes devastating. The key was to notice, analyze, and act with clarity rather than emotion. Months turned into a year. My life stabilized in ways I had never imagined. My career regained momentum, my relationships strengthened, and the lake house became a place of healing, reflection, and growth. I even started mentoring young colleagues in my field, teaching them not only about strategy and planning, but about observation, critical thinking, and recognizing patterns in human behavior. Leela's influence had permeated every aspect of my life, shaping me into someone more resilient, perceptive, and capable than I had ever been before. But even in this period of calm, the memory of betrayals and premonitions lingered. I couldn't forget the lessons learned, nor did I want to. They were now part of me, woven into my perception of the world. I had been given warnings and nearly squandered them. I had been betrayed by those I loved and had survived. And I had learned to trust not only my instincts, but those rare individuals who saw beyond the surface of things, like Leela. It was during one quiet evening as I walked along the shore, watching the reflection of the moon shimmer on the water, that I truly understood the final lesson. Life is unpredictable. People will deceive, betray, and exploit when opportunity arises. But the power lies in seeing clearly, in observing without bias, and in responding with wisdom rather than emotion. Leela had given me that power through her warnings, and I had finally learned to use it. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of closure. I had faced every premonition, every betrayal, every challenge, and I had survived. My life was no longer fragile or easily manipulated. It was resilient, fortified by lessons learned the hard way. As I returned to the lake house, I noticed a letter waiting for me on the porch. It was from Leela, written in her careful, deliberate script. "You have survived. You have learned. You see now what others cannot. Remember, the real power is not in prediction, but in preparation, observation, and understanding. Carry this with you always." I held the letter, feeling the weight of her words. Every betrayal, every warning, every challenge had led me here. I had been shaped, not broken, and I knew that whatever the future held, I would face it with clarity, courage, and the wisdom of experience. From that day forward, I carried Leela's lessons with me, not as warnings of doom, but as tools of empowerment. I became more mindful, more aware, and more resilient. I understood that premonitions were not mystical, but practical insights, opportunities to act wisely before it was too late. I had learned to trust those who truly saw, to act decisively, and to survive even the most calculated betrayals. And in the quiet moments sitting by the lake, I often reflected on how close I had come to ignoring the very guidance that had saved me. how fragile trust can be, how easily life can unravel, and how vital it is to pay attention to the subtle patterns that reveal the truth about people, situations, and ourselves. Through it all, Leela remained my constant, a reminder that even in a world filled with deception, insight and awareness can guide us safely through the storms. I realized that the greatest premonitions are not about predicting the future. They are about teaching us to navigate the present with eyes wide open, to recognize danger before it strikes, and to emerge from the trials of life stronger than before. And in the first time in a long time, I felt not only relief, but a profound sense of mastery over my life, my choices, and the lessons I had been given. Lessons I would carry with me for the rest of my days. The months that followed were a period of rebuilding, reflection, and quiet growth. I had learned to navigate life with a heightened sense of awareness, and every decision I made was now measured, deliberate, and informed by the lessons of the past. I returned to my career with renewed focus, taking on projects that challenged me intellectually and emotionally. My work became not just a means of financial stability, but a platform to exercise the vigilance and discernment I had honed over the past year. Even as I thrived professionally, the emotional scars remained. Trust was no longer automatic. It was something to be earned and verified. Friends, family, and colleagues were all seen through a lens sharpened by experience. I noticed small inconsistencies, fleeting expressions, and hidden motives that once would have gone unnoticed. Leela's guidance had transformed my perception of the world. I understood now that people reveal themselves through subtle behaviors long before their intentions become clear. One crisp autumn morning, I received an unexpected call from Sarah. She had been assisting me with the management of the trust funds and legal matters, but this call carried urgency. "I think someone is watching us," she said, her voice tight with fear. "There's unusual activity, emails, phone calls, people asking questions about the trust. I'm not sure who or why, but it feels deliberate." I felt a chill run down my spine. Despite having secured the funds, the pattern Sarah noticed indicated that someone else was trying to manipulate the situation. The calm I had worked so hard to achieve was suddenly threatened. I called Leela immediately. "Sarah is right," she said after listening carefully. "The final premonition isn't over. There's someone still testing you, someone who wants to see if you've truly learned to see, to observe, to act. You must remain vigilant. Watch for patterns, inconsistencies, and subtle cues. The lesson isn't just survival, it's mastery." I spent the next several days reviewing all correspondence, monitoring accounts, and tracking unusual behavior. It became clear that the orchestrator was someone who had observed my recovery from the chaos, the way I had rebuilt my career, secured the trust funds, and restored my personal stability. This person was testing me, waiting for a sign of weakness. One evening, as I sat in the study, surrounded by papers and documents, I noticed an email from a business associate that seemed innocuous at first glance, but something felt off. I examined the sender's address, the phrasing of the email, and subtle anomalies in grammar and tone. It was deliberate, calculated. Someone was trying to elicit a response to gauge my awareness. I called Leela. "It's happening again," I said, frustration and fatigue in my voice. "Someone is trying to provoke me, test me, see if I'll make a mistake." She was calm. "Then respond as you've learned. Observe. Don't react emotionally. Let the patterns reveal themselves. This is the final stage, the ultimate test of your vigilance and discernment." I spent the next several days reviewing all correspondence, monitoring accounts, and tracking unusual behavior. It became clear that the orchestrator was someone who had observed my recovery from the chaos, the way I had rebuilt my career, secured the trust funds, and restored my personal stability. This person was testing me, waiting for a sign of weakness. One evening, as I sat in the study, surrounded by papers and documents, I noticed an email from a business associate that seemed innocuous at first glance, but something felt off. I examined the sender's address, the phrasing of the email, and subtle anomalies in grammar and tone. It was deliberate, calculated. Someone was trying to elicit a response to gauge my awareness. I called Leela. "It's happening again," I said, frustration and fatigue in my voice. "Someone is trying to provoke me, test me, see if I'll make a mistake." She was calm. "Then respond as you've learned. Observe, don't react emotionally. Let the patterns reveal themselves. This is the final stage, the ultimate test of your vigilance and discernment." I followed her advice meticulously. I documented everything, verified every claim, and carefully crafted responses without revealing my awareness. Each interaction became a study in behavior, the timing of replies, the choice of words, subtle shifts in tone. Patterns emerged slowly but clearly. The person testing me was close to the circle of individuals who had supported me after the initial betrayals, someone I had never suspected because of their outward loyalty and calm demeanor. When I finally confronted the evidence, the truth was staggering. It was Sarah's distant cousin, someone who had been quietly assisting us, but had secretly been manipulating situations to observe my reactions. The betrayal was almost surreal, not malicious in the same way as Daniel's, but calculated, analytical, and chilling. This was the premonition Leela had warned about, the one that would test not only my ability to survive, but my capacity to recognize and respond to subtle, hidden threats. I confronted the individual calmly, presenting the evidence, tracing patterns, and highlighting inconsistencies. They initially denied everything, but the pattern was undeniable. Every lie, every attempt to manipulate, every deviation from normal behavior was documented. The confrontation was tense, and for a moment I felt the old fear return, the kind that had plagued me when Daniel and my relatives had betrayed me. But this time I remained composed, alert, and confident. I had learned to trust my observations and act decisively. By the end of the meeting, the manipulator had admitted to the deceit, explaining that their intention had been to test my awareness and resilience. The relief I felt was immense, but it was tempered by the sobering realization that vigilance would always be necessary. Life would continue to test me, but now I was equipped with the tools to navigate any challenge. In the weeks that followed, I focused on consolidating my life. The trust funds were secure, my career continued to grow, and my personal life regained stability. I nurtured relationships with those who had proven their loyalty and integrity, and I maintained a cautious distance from individuals whose motives were unclear. The lake house became a sanctuary for reflection, planning, and observation, a place where I could both recharge and remain alert to the patterns around me. Leela remained a guiding presence, though her interventions were rare. She encouraged me to trust my instincts, to observe, and to act without hesitation when necessary. Her lessons were now internalized. I no longer needed her to point out the obvious. I had learned to see what others could not, to recognize patterns, and to anticipate potential challenges before they became crises. One evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. From the initial premonitions about my career and engagement to the betrayals by Daniel and family members, every event had been a lesson in observation, awareness, and resilience. I realized that Leela's premonitions were not mystical, they were practical insights, the result of careful attention to human behavior and subtle patterns. The eerie accuracy of her warnings had forced me to confront my own blind spots and develop skills that would serve me for a lifetime. I also understood the emotional impact of the journey. The betrayals had been painful, sometimes devastating, but they had taught me the value of discernment, patience, and self-reliance. I had learned to navigate relationships with clarity, to recognize loyalty and deceit, and to act decisively when necessary. The experience had forged me into someone stronger, more resilient, and more perceptive than I had ever been before. In the quiet of the lake house, I often thought about the nature of premonitions and warnings. They were not about predicting the future, but about offering opportunities to prepare, observe, and act wisely. The real power lay not in foresight, but in the ability to respond effectively, to recognize patterns, and to navigate life with awareness and courage. Leela had given me that power, and I had finally learned to wield it responsibly. As I continued to rebuild my life, I maintained a practice of daily reflection. I would review interactions, observe behaviors, and analyze patterns in both personal and professional contexts. This practice became a form of empowerment, a way to ensure that I remained vigilant without becoming paranoid. It was a delicate balance, but one I had mastered through experience and guidance. The final lesson of Leela's premonitions became clear over time. Life will always present challenges, betrayals, and unexpected events. What matters is not the inevitability of these occurrences, but how we respond to them. Awareness, observation, discernment, and even after months of relative peace, I sensed that life had one final test in store for me. Lila had warned me repeatedly that the hardest part was yet to come, and though I had survived betrayals, manipulation, and premonitions, a lingering tension had settled over me, a quiet unease that never fully disappeared. I told myself it was just caution, a leftover from past trauma, but deep down, I knew she was right. Something still waited. It began subtly, with small disruptions in my routine. Emails went unanswered, phone calls were mysteriously redirected, and meetings that had been confirmed suddenly vanished from calendars. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence, but the patterns, however slight, were undeniable. Someone was testing me again, probing my defenses, searching for weakness. And I knew instinctively that this time the challenge would be personal, hitting closer to home than anything before. The first indication of the final premonition's full weight came on a quiet Tuesday morning. I received a text from my father's attorney, a woman I had trusted implicitly. The message was brief but urgent. "We need to meet today regarding the final allocation of the trust. Something has come up. Please come immediately." I felt a ripple of unease. Lila had always cautioned me to trust evidence over instinct, but intuition told me that this meeting would be pivotal. I called her immediately. "It's happening," I said, pacing the room. "The last test. I can feel it." She didn't sound surprised. "Then observe carefully. This is the culmination. Stay calm. Patterns will guide you. Watch for deception, for misdirection, and for subtle cues. Your response will determine not only the outcome, but how you carry forward from here." When I arrived at the attorney's office, I noticed the tension in the air immediately. The room was filled with people I hadn't seen in months, some relatives, financial advisors, even Daniel's estranged associate. Their presence, innocuous on the surface, carried undertones of scrutiny and calculation. The air felt charged, every glance loaded with intent. The attorney began with a measured explanation. A previously undisclosed clause in the trust had come to light, one that required direct testimony and verification from all involved parties. She carefully outlined the requirements, noting discrepancies and ambiguities that needed clarification. As she spoke, I noticed the subtle glances exchanged among the attendees, the faint shifts in posture, the micro-expressions that betrayed motives, suspicion, and even fear. I realized in that moment that this was the ultimate test, the final premonition Lila had warned about. It wasn't about finances, documents, or legalities. It was about clarity, observation, and integrity under pressure. This was the culmination of all the lessons I had learned, the betrayals, the manipulations, the premonitions. They had all prepared me for this precise moment. As discussions progressed, it became clear that one relative in particular, my cousin Mark, had been subtly influencing interpretations of the trust to his advantage. He spoke with confidence, presenting evidence that seemed legitimate but was in fact carefully manipulated. I had learned to see this, the inconsistencies in phrasing, the hesitation before critical statements, the calculated overemphasis on minor points. Every micro-expression, every pause, every choice of words betrayed his underlying strategy. I called upon all I had learned from Lila. Calmly, I challenged the points he raised, presenting meticulous documentation and observations that contradicted his assertions. I remained composed, my tone steady and neutral, refusing to react emotionally despite the rising tension in the room. Every pattern I had studied over the past months guided my responses, allowing me to anticipate his moves, counter his arguments, and maintain control of the narrative. The confrontation escalated slowly. Mark tried subtle intimidation tactics, leaning forward aggressively, raising his voice slightly, planting doubts about my credibility. But I had learned to read these maneuvers. I mirrored calmness, asked precise questions, and drew attention to inconsistencies that exposed his manipulation without ever revealing my own fear or frustration. Hours passed like this, a tense dance of observation and counter-observation. I noticed the reactions of others in the room, the advisors who had been swayed by Mark's initial presentation, the relatives who had been silent observers, and even Daniel's former associate, whose presence now seemed almost irrelevant but symbolically threatening. Everyone was watching, and I realized that this final premonition was not just about Mark or the trust. It was about proving my mastery of discernment under pressure. Finally, the evidence became irrefutable. Mark's carefully constructed arguments began to collapse as each inconsistency was exposed, each manipulated document challenged, each subtle lie revealed. The attorney, after reviewing my evidence, confirmed that the trust was being executed according to my father's original intentions, and that no manipulation or misdirection would succeed. As the room settled, the tension lifting, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The test had been completed, the final premonition fulfilled, but it was more than just legal victory. It was the culmination of months of growth, vigilance, and learning. I had faced the ultimate test of awareness and discernment, and I had passed. After the meeting, I walked outside to the crisp evening air. The sky was streaked with the warm hues of sunset, and the lake shimmered faintly in the distance. I felt the weight of the past year's experiences, the betrayals, the losses, the manipulations, lifting, replaced by a sense of clarity and accomplishment. I had survived the unthinkable, navigated deception with precision, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. Later that evening, I received a call from Lila. Her voice, calm and measured, carried warmth I had come to depend on. "You've completed the final test. You've faced betrayal, manipulation, and challenges that would have crushed most people. But you've not only survived, you've grown. You understand now what it means to observe, to discern, and to act with clarity. The premonitions were never about predicting the future. They were about teaching you to navigate it wisely. I felt tears prick my eyes. "I understand now," I said softly. "Every warning, every moment of doubt, every betrayal, it was all preparation. I see it clearly." She paused, then added, "The journey doesn't end here. Life will continue to challenge you, as it does everyone. But you now carry the tools to navigate those challenges with insight, vigilance, and resilience. That is the true gift of what you've learned." I reflected on everything that had happened: the ruined career, the shattered engagement, the manipulated inheritance, the betrayals by Daniel, my family, and even trusted friends. Each event had been painful, sometimes devastating, but collectively they had forged a version of myself I could never have imagined. I was stronger, more perceptive, and more capable than I had been before. In the days that followed, I returned to a rhythm of quiet reflection and deliberate action. I continued my work, maintained vigilance in personal and professional relationships, and nurtured bonds with those who had proven trustworthy. The lake house became a sanctuary for contemplation and learning, a place where I could reflect on patterns, behaviors, and the lessons of human nature. I also began to share my experiences in small, careful ways, mentoring colleagues, advising friends, and helping those who had been blindsided by betrayal understand the value of observation and discernment. Lila's lessons were no longer abstract concepts. They had become practical tools for navigating life. One evening, as I watched the sunset over the lake, I thought about the journey from the first premonitions to this final test. I realized that the greatest lesson of all was not about avoiding betrayal, loss, or deception. It was about awareness, resilience, and the ability to act decisively when circumstances demanded it. Life would always present challenges, but I now understood that the ability to see patterns, recognize subtle cues, and respond with clarity was more powerful than any warning, any premonition, or any piece of advice. As I stood there, I felt a profound sense of closure. The premonitions that once felt like curses were now understood as gifts, opportunities to act wisely, to protect myself, and to emerge stronger from adversity. I had faced every warning, every betrayal, every challenge, and I had survived. More than that, I had learned to thrive. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully appreciated before. The calm that settled over my life after the final confrontation was different from any peace I had known before. It wasn't naive or fragile. It was steady, deliberate, earned through fire and vigilance. I often found myself sitting on the lake house porch, staring at the water as the sun dipped below the horizon, reflecting not only the colors of the sky, but also the lessons etched into my mind. Each ripple seemed to remind me that life moves forward, and all that remains is how we navigate it. Even with the trust secured, the betrayals confronted, and the premonitions fulfilled, I realized that the hardest work was internal. My heart still bore the scars of Daniel's calculated deceit, the subtle manipulations of family, and the sense of helplessness I had felt when my career and relationships were threatened. But I now understood that pain, when acknowledged and examined, becomes a teacher. Each wound had forced me to sharpen my perception, to trust evidence over assumption, to observe rather than react impulsively. I was no longer the person who ignored Leela's warnings, dismissing her foresight as paranoia. I had become someone capable of seeing what others overlooked. In the months following the culmination of the trust disputes, I focused on rebuilding relationships with those who had proven loyal. I invested in connections that had integrity at their core, people whose actions matched their words, whose empathy was genuine, and whose support was unwavering. I also learned to maintain boundaries, recognizing that vulnerability without discernment could be dangerous. It was a delicate balance, but one I now understood intuitively. Leela became an even more profound presence in my life, though our interactions were quieter, less direct. Her role was no longer to guide me through crises, it was to serve as a mirror for reflection, a reminder of the lessons embedded in every premonition and betrayal. I often thought of her cryptic warnings and realized they had been less about fear and more about preparation. She had trained me to see human behavior with clarity, to recognize the patterns of deceit, loyalty, and intent that most people miss entirely. Her foresight had never been supernatural, it had been disciplined, analytical, and profoundly intuitive. One afternoon, I received a message from Sarah. She had been working on charitable initiatives in our community, and she invited me to join her in an event supporting families affected by financial fraud and deception. At first, I hesitated. The past year had exhausted me emotionally, but then I realized that this was part of my journey, the opportunity to use the lessons I had learned to help others navigate betrayal and regain agency over their lives. I accepted. The event was intimate, yet deeply moving. I listened to people recount stories that echoed my own, deceit by those they had trusted, losses that seemed insurmountable, and the emotional toll of betrayal. As I shared my story, carefully, without exposing every detail, I saw faces light up with recognition. People understood that while betrayal is painful and often inevitable, awareness and discernment can provide a path to survival and growth. My words carried weight, not because of triumph or vengeance, but because they were rooted in lived experience, in the hard-won understanding of human behavior and resilience. In the quiet aftermath of the event, I walked alone along the lakeside. The moon reflected off the water like a silver mirror, and the stillness of the night gave me clarity. I thought of Daniel, of Mark, of the cousin who had tested me after the trust disputes, and of every person who had challenged me in ways both subtle and devastating. I no longer felt anger in the way I once had. Instead, I felt a profound sense of understanding. Betrayal is often more about the betrayer than the betrayed, and clarity, observation, and self-respect are the shields that allow us to navigate life intact. I began to document my experiences, not for fame, not for recognition, but as a record of the lessons I had learned. Each chapter, each reflection was an exploration of human behavior, intuition, and resilience. I wanted to leave behind a blueprint for others who might face similar trials, a reminder that vigilance, discernment, and careful observation are not signs of fear, but tools of empowerment. As weeks turned into months, I noticed a transformation within myself that went beyond survival. I was no longer haunted by the premonitions or betrayals. Instead, they had become anchors of wisdom. I could anticipate risks without paranoia, evaluate intentions without cynicism, and act decisively without hesitation. Life had tested me repeatedly, and through each trial I had grown, not just in knowledge, but in emotional strength and moral clarity. One morning, I sat down with Leela for a long conversation. We watched the sunrise together, the golden light spilling across the lake. "Do you ever feel exhausted?" I asked. "After everything, the betrayals, the tests, the lessons, it sometimes feels endless." She smiled gently. "It is exhausting," she admitted, "but that exhaustion is a mark of growth. It is the weight of wisdom, the cost of survival, and the reward of awareness. You are not burdened, you are fortified. The premonitions, the betrayals, the challenges, they were all tools, shaping you into someone capable of navigating life with eyes wide open." I nodded, finally understanding the depth of what she had been teaching me. The true value of foresight is not predicting events, it is learning how to respond wisely when events unfold. The real power lies in observation, discernment, and action. Leela had given me that power, and I had used it to survive, to reclaim my life, and to help others do the same. In the months that followed, I continued to integrate these lessons into every aspect of my life. I nurtured meaningful relationships, built a career based on integrity and careful judgment, and maintained a life structured around observation and awareness. The lake house became a symbol not of fear or isolation, but of reflection and strength. Each day I walked the shore, reflecting on the patterns of human behavior, the lessons of the past, and the knowledge that I was no longer a passive participant in my life. I was an active, vigilant, and empowered agent of my own destiny. Looking back, I realized that every premonition Leela had given me, the ruined career, the shattered engagement, the stolen inheritance, the betrayals, had been opportunities to develop insight, resilience, and discernment. What had once seemed like fear or curse was actually preparation, a rigorous training in awareness. I had been tested repeatedly, and each test had made me stronger, wiser, and more capable of navigating life's uncertainties. And in the quiet moments, as I watched the lake shimmer under the moonlight, I finally understood the ultimate lesson. Life will always present challenges, betrayals, and surprise events. We cannot control the actions of others, nor can we predict every outcome, but we can control how we respond. Awareness, observation, discernment, and decisive action are the tools that allow us to survive and thrive no matter the circumstances. I felt a deep sense of closure. The premonitions that once filled me with fear were now understood as gifts, guiding me toward growth, resilience, and empowerment. The betrayals that once cut deeply were now lessons, shaping me into someone capable of recognizing loyalty and deceit, acting with clarity, and navigating life with wisdom. I was no longer the person who dismissed warnings or ignored subtle cues. I had become someone who sees, understands, and acts with purpose. In the end, I realized that the true power of foresight lies not in the prediction itself, but in the preparation, awareness, and insight it fosters. Leela's premonitions were precise because they were rooted in observation and understanding, and my journey had proven that even the most chilling warnings can become instruments of growth when met with clarity, resilience, and deliberate action. As I closed my journal that night, I felt a profound sense of peace. The trials were over, the lessons learned, and the future uncertain but manageable. I had faced the darkest moments of betrayal, deception, and loss, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and fully aware of my own power to navigate life. And for the first time in a long while, I was free, not from fear, not from challenge, but from the uncertainty that comes from ignorance. I had learned to see, and seeing, I realized, was everything. I carried this understanding forward, not as a burden, but as a compass. Life would continue to present its tests, but I knew now that with awareness, discernment, and courage, I could face anything, overcome any deception, and emerge not only unbroken, but empowered. The premonitions had come true, the betrayals had cut deep, but in the end, I had survived, and I had finally, fully seen. The story was over, the lessons remained, and I was ready for everything that came next.